All right, welcome back to the History of the United States to 1877. We're still in Unit 2, discussing From Colonies to Nation, the process by which these few colonies of the British on the Atlantic coast of North America turn into a country. Last time we were here, we discussed the American Revolution, and we were able to sort of outline the process by which these colonists won a war against this great empire, the British Empire. Today what we're going to discuss is the creation of a government, at least the initial attempt to create a government with the Articles of Confederation. There are three big things that we're going to look at here. The first thing we're going to look at is the creation of the Articles of Confederation. What were some of the debates and the ideas that influenced its creation? What did the Articles actually say? Then we're going to move into some of the good and the bad, right? So what were some of the accomplishments of the Articles of Confederation? Because it wasn't all bad. There were some good things that were done, and so we need to talk about some of those good things and those precedents that were set. And then finally, the problems. Chiefly the revolts and the inability of this convention, this confederation, to stay together and defend itself. And that will lead to calls for reform. So that's basically what we're going to cover in this lecture while we discuss the Articles of Confederation between about 1776 and 1787. All right, so when the Revolution first started off, there's going to be this explosion of experimentation, right? So all of these colonies suddenly are independent states. All of a sudden, they don't have legitimacy from the royal charters that they were given. Those charters are now gone. They want to create new charters, new documents to establish the legality of their rule. Now, this is an old thing that goes way back in the colonial period, the idea that we have charters. You can start with the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which in the 1660s, which were one of the first adopted constitutions for self-government in North America, and how that goes all the way through to the various charters that you find throughout the colonies. So once the royal government is being rejected through this Declaration of Independence, it becomes clear that we need some experimentation. We need some advice on what kind of government we should have. In 1776, John Adams, at the behest of the government of North Carolina, will write down some of his thoughts and suggestions on what these governments should look like. What should a just constitution look like? And these thoughts were published in a pamphlet called Thoughts on Government. And so he addresses three basic things, right? What should legislative power be like? What should executive power be like? And what should judicial power be like? Because this is something that we need to understand, is that all governments, no matter what time they're created, no matter what form of government they have, all governments have three basic powers. The power to do, executive power, the power to make law, legislative power, and the power to judge if you've broken the law, judicial power. All governments have these powers. So the only thing that distinguishes one form of government from another is how these various powers are organized and balanced within the system. So if we have all three powers, or a majority of these powers, in the possession of a single person, that's a monarchy, right? If they pass that power down to a hereditary heir, that's what a monarchy is. And so what these people are doing, what these colonists are doing now, they're trying to form states with, constitutions that are going to last, and so how do we do that? Well, John Adams is going to offer his 2 cents. No doubt he is influenced by the Baron de Montesquieu, who wrote The Spirit of the Laws. I think in the 1730s or 40s, he published a book where he talked about the separation of powers being the ways to preserve political liberty. So let's I'm going to do a summary here. If you want to read Adams' thoughts on government, you can look up the pamphlet. It's not hard to find. You can go in and do a deep dive into Adams' ideas regarding government and balances of power. But we're just going to hit just some of the highlights here. So basically, Adams advocated for a bicameral legislature. Now, what does that mean? That means we have two legislative bodies, one that checks the other. So we don't have one body that makes all the laws without any advice or consent from another group. Now, his idea here is that in his experience, and this will be the truth in his experience in the Continental Congress and the Confederation Congress, as we'll see, is that he describes, quote, "A single assembly is liable to all the vices, follies, and frailties of an individual, subject to fits of humor, transports of passion, partialities, and prejudice, and from these and other causes apt to make rash results and absurd judgments. All which errors ought to be corrected and inconveniences guarded against by some controlling power." So he basically sees that a group of people will begin to act as an individual, begin to act with all of the passion and blind fury of an individual who gets angry. He suggests that we need some check in the system. There needs to be some other individual group that will check the passions of this group. And so that's where he is saying, well, I think we should have a bicameral legislature. He also argued for an independent executive. He did not like the idea of having an executive committee, by which, in his argument, and I'll quote him, assemblies lack two of the characteristics that are very important to a good executive, and they are, quote, secrecy and dispatch, unquote. You can't operate in secrecy when you're trying to operate a war, which we're obviously trying to do, and you can't work with efficiency and speed. By the time you make a decision in a committee, the battle is over. The troops aren't needed there anymore. They're needed somewhere else, and we have to start a whole new debate on where to send them. So, having a unitary or an independent executive where Parliament isn't, in control of it, where the legislative branch doesn't control the executive, is going to be much more efficient. And this is a key criticism that Adams will have of the British system, which basically has the executive chosen out of the legislative branch. Parliament will get together and they will select the Prime Minister and the executive branch of the government. So there's no real separation of powers between these two groups, and Adams is adamant that we need that. He also argued that we need a separate judicial. Judicial power needs to be outside of a legislative body. His argument here is that members of a legislative body are, quote, less qualified because it is too numerous, too slow, and generally too little skilled in the law. So he wants people who are lawyers, who that's all they do is study the law. They're not trying to make and change laws. They're trying to understand the laws as written. So really what Adams is talking about here is a separation of powers. 3 separate independent groups where these powers of government are divided up among these groups, where they can sort of check and balance the power so no one group is able to control more than 2 of these powers. So that's going to be a great influence in the construction of our Constitution later, as we'll find out. However, it will not be much of an influence on the Articles of Confederation, which will not take very many of the suggestions offered by John Adams in the Experiments of Government. Now, many states are going to take Adams. They're going to take these ideas. They're going to try to create their own constitutions. Many states are going to have bicameral legislatures and a guarantee of individual rights and a property requirement for voting, along with a property requirement for holding office, and a focus on the governed having consent of the people. This is huge, right? This is a very interesting idea, this idea of popular sovereignty, that the power of government doesn't come from on high, it comes from at the bottom. It comes from the individual people. And this of course, comes straight from Hobbes and Locke, the enlightened philosophers of political theory from the 16 and early 1700s. So now let's take a look at this property requirement real quick, because a lot of people don't like this idea because we don't have it today, and so it's seen as being a problem. And to some degree, it obviously is a problem. If the government only represents landed property owners, people without property will not have a voice in government, and so their issues will be glossed over. So why would the founders sort of all move in this direction? It has to do with who pays taxes. Taxes are based upon property taxes. So the people who own the property should have a say in what their taxes are. If you don't own property, you're not paying the taxes. Therefore, you shouldn't be able to raise someone else's taxes without having to face that burden yourself. So it's almost like you're trying to prevent a third party from being able to vote taxes on another person without their consent, which will end up being a problem, as we'll find out later on in the way the country organizes itself. But this is going to be the basic idea of what the kind of constitutions are going to be thrown together. But don't think that the constitutions are going to be sort of carbon copied or cookie cutter. They're going to be very interesting, and a lot of exciting experimentations in government are going to take place. In fact, it's so exciting that many of the members of the Second Continental Congress, who are trying to form a national government, who are trying to organize a response to the start of this war with Great Britain, who are trying to write a national constitution and a Declaration of Independence and all of these legal things that must be done at the national level, they're not interested in that. Like, many of these members of the Second Continental Congress are trying to leave this Congress to go back to their states to help draft the state constitutions, which they see as far more important than a national constitution. And I think this is a big deal. I mean, we tend to gloss over this idea that, obviously the national government is more important and more powerful. That's not the case. These various colonies, which are turning into states, that's where the real power lies. That's where people want to be. That's where people associate their identity with. They don't associate themselves with some national government. There is no national government. It doesn't have any history to it. It doesn't have any grit to it. It's just your state, which has a history of over 100 years of identity. So people are abandoning the national Congress to go back to their states to help have a voice in the creation of these state constitutions. And I'll give you two examples of some of the principles in these constitutions, because they're wide and varied. So Virginia, for example, Section 2 of the Virginia State Constitution holds that, quote, that all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. The magistrates and their trustees and servants are at all times amenable to them, unquote. So we see here an open declaration that the power of government comes directly from the people, and if you're working in government, you're working for the people. You're not out there on your own. You don't have your own little way of doing things. You are responsible to the people. Another example of this comes from Pennsylvania, which in order to pass a law, the representatives in the Pennsylvania Assembly would have to vote on whether they think the law is good or bad, right? They would vote yay or nay. But then the law would not take effect. They would have to return to their home districts, and they would have to explain the law to their constituency, and then debate it with their constituency. I voted in favor of this law, and these are the reasons why. And then the constituency would come back with their opinions. And then if they agreed with you, fine. If they didn't, you had to change your vote. So this was a very interesting idea, that you would vote on something, you would then return to your district, you would then debate that among your constituency, and then return for an ultimate vote on whether or not the law should pass. And Pennsylvania would also have a council of censors, and this goes back to the Roman Republic. Those of you who remember your Roman Republic. Censors were there to sort of watch and regulate the Senate of Rome, right? They regulated who was allowed into the Senate of Rome. They were very important in terms of organizing people based on their wealth, which was how the different assemblies were organized. So censors were regulators of the assemblies. And so Pennsylvania would have their own council of censors whose job was to oversee government action. So what do we see here? We see a fear of executive power. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, here we have colonies who are revolting against a government that was abusing its power. It was abusing its executive power. Legislature was making laws, and the legislature was enforcing laws. There was no check on their power. The king wasn't keeping his magistrates in order. There was no division of power between the executive and judicial power or legislative power in the British government, because it was the British Parliament who appointed the judiciary, right? I mean, these admiralty courts that were being used to abuse the rights of colonists. All of this stuff is coming out of Parliament. And so the main theme here, and all these different constitutions that are being developed in all these different states across this new country that we're trying to develop, we are scared of executive power. We're very weary of it. So they wanted to weaken the upper chambers of the legislature. They wanted to weaken governors, and they wanted to emphasize lower houses, which were more connected to the people, right? So they want to try to put all the power back in the people. So this is sort of the idea that we're setting up here. The idea is that the focus of these governments is on the people. We want to limit executive power. Okay? So with that in mind, let's jump into the Articles of Confederation, which are going to be written in this atmosphere at the national level. So the Articles of Confederation are going to be created about the same time as the Declaration of Independence. So the Second Continental Congress puts together a committee. Jefferson and Adams and Franklin are going off to write a Declaration of Independence. Meanwhile, another committee is created to write a constitution for our new country. And what is that going to look like? Well, I'll tell you what, most of these delegates represent their states. They're not representing the people as a whole. They're representing their states. They were chosen by their legislatures, and so they're there to preserve the individual character and the sovereignty of their state. They are afraid of some monstrous general will that will, just sort of take over. And I'll give you an example of this and try to make it a little more concrete. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, he was a member of the committee chosen to write the Articles of Confederation. And Rutledge feared central power. He feared a centralized national power that could dominate the states. He predicted that this arrangement would lead to ruin, which, if you look at our current situation, it's debatable. We could maybe argue that. But he feared the influence of eastern provinces. Okay, so let me explain what he's worried about. What is this sort of miasma of general will? What is this sort of cloud of power that he's worried about? New England. Think about what New England is doing in 1774, 1775, and 1776. New England is starting a war with Great Britain. Did any of the other colonies vote on war? Did South Carolina stand up and go, we're in favor of this conflict, go to it? No. The Massachusetts local assemblies did this stuff on their own. They're the ones who fired at British troops. They're the ones who ordered Connecticut militia to go and capture British fortresses on Lake Champlain in 1775. They're the ones who ordered Benedict Arnold to invade Canada in 1775. It was only after a lot of this violence was happening that the Continental Congress was trying to get ahead of it. And by that time it was too late. Peace was impossible, which is where these people find themselves in 1776 when they're trying to write these Articles of Confederation. They're finding themselves in a situation where they really don't have a choice. So here comes we're creating this national government, and Edward Rutledge is worried that these New Englanders will, with their political intrigues, their manipulations, they will fill the committees and meeting houses and congresses, and they're going to dominate the other states. Massachusetts is a highly populous state. They have a lot more population than South Carolina. So this is clearly a concern that a lot of these other representatives are going to have. And as a result, Rutledge promised to ensure that this new government only possessed those powers that were minimally required to accomplish its goals. So as a result, the Articles of Confederation are going to be weak. They're going to sort of lean on and require state cooperation in order to accomplish anything. Now, these articles are going to be written in 1776, but pretty much debate is going to stop about 1777. After the Battle of Saratoga, we've got our ambassadors in France trying to convince the French to back our cause. The French aren't going to back our cause unless we can win a major battle and prove that we're a government. And so, once we win our major battle, okay, these articles, that's what we've got, boys, let's go with it. And so they present the Articles of Confederation as an official government, and we operate under this government during the American Revolution. They're not officially ratified by the various states until like 1781 when the war is over, but that's beside the point. So let's take a look at who is responsible for writing these Articles of Confederation. And that is a man that we should be familiar with, a man named John Dickinson. John Dickinson is going to be the chair of this committee. He is of note because of his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. This was written back in 1767, almost a decade before, with the Townshend Act. So quite a bit of things have changed since then. And Dickinson is going to be responsible for writing these articles, or at least being in charge of the committee that writes them. So let's detail what the Articles of Confederation actually are. Right? I'm going to read through. There are 13 articles. I've got them summarized in these bullet points here, but I'm going to read through all of them, at least give you a summary of all of them, kind of go into a little detail here. This document promised to create, quote, a perpetual union between the states, unquote. Now, we know that this is not going to be the case. These articles are going to be replaced in 1787, and they're ratified eventually in 1789. The replacement would be ratified in 1789, but we know that this document will be replaced. So what are the things that this document says? Article 1 basically names the country, right? So Article 1 names this brand new confederacy the United States of America. Now, this is important, okay? We are defining the national government as a collection of sovereign, independent states. We're not naming it America. We're not naming it, New Britain. We're not naming it something unifying. We're naming it something where we're identifying the pieces of it, right? So the United States, because men like Rutledge are not going to go along with some national government that glosses over his state. So we're gonna acknowledge that we are United States. We're a bunch of independent states working together to fight a war, right? To establish ourselves. Article 2, again, reassurance that these states, quote, remain sovereign. Let me quote it, right? So these states, that each state, quote, retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, unquote. Sorry, I had a brain fart there. So each state is going to retain its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. That's a big deal to these men, all right? They're not going to come in here and just whitewash over their states. They're going to defend their states, the independence of their state, the character of their state. So Article 3 binds the several states in a, quote, firm league of friendship. So this is going to encourage the states to work together. So even though we're independent, we are together, and we're going to work together. Article 4 promises that free inhabitants of the several states share the same rights and privileges that may freely move throughout the country. So we don't have any second-class citizens. All the citizens of these various states are equal in their rights and their freedom to move about the country. Article 5 discusses the method of representation for these states in the Confederation Congress. We're going to have a unicameral legislature. Okay, we have one body, one legislative body, and states could have anywhere between 2 and 7 representatives in this Confederation Congress. However, each state could only receive a single vote. So when you get to Congress, there is no proportion here, right? There's no Massachusetts has more power and more population than South Carolina, so Massachusetts gets to sort of dominate the group. See, smaller states are concerned about this possibility, and that is why they're putting this in here. And that will be a major point of contention when we get to the writing of our Constitution in 1787. I'll move around a little bit. So Article 7 states that taxes and levies are intended to pay for said expenditures, and they're left to the state legislature. This is huge, okay? We're fighting a war against Great Britain because of taxes, right? Representation and all of that stuff. So in this national government, it can't raise taxes. Basically, it can say We vote to raise taxes on certain things. Now we have to hope, wish, and pray that the states will collect these taxes for us and put it in the mail and send it to the federal government, right, to the national government. That there is no means by which this federal government can actually enforce the taxes that it imposes. It has to hope, wish, and pray that the states will collect these taxes for them. That's going to be a problem later on, as we'll find out. Article 9 established a Confederation Congress as the last word on war and peace. Congress shall also create and regulate currency, but look at this caveat, except, quote, provided that the legislative right of any state within its own limits be not infringed or violated, unquote. This, again, Congress is in charge of a national currency, except for the currencies that are created by the various legislatures, because we can't really control what the legislatures do, right? So again, even when the Confederation Congress tries to create a power, they preface it by saying, but we're not interfering with what the states do, right? The states can still do their thing. But another thing we need to mention, which I kind of glossed over, is that Article 9 says that the Confederation Congress, the last word on war and peace. This is very important. This is incredibly important. We can't have these various states decide to go off on their own. If they're so sovereign, why couldn't Georgia just go, you know what, we never voted for this war. King George, if you'll grant us all kinds of protections and special privileges, we'll sign a peace treaty right here and we'll fight for you, right? Or New York, for example, were to just hand over all of its possessions and sort of go along with the British. This would be a disaster for this revolution that we're trying to fight against Britain. We're not going to be able to survive it if we don't stay together. We have to be united together so that the British can't tease us apart. A great example of that is the independent Republic of Vermont. A little backstory here. We know that Vermont is some contested land between New Hampshire and New York. And they want to be an independent colony, but New York is against it. New York is claiming that territory for its own. And because New York has a sizable delegation in the Confederation Congress, Vermont has no chance of being recognized as an independent state. Well, during the war, I'm trying to remember the date here. I'll get it for you later. But during the war, Vermont is going to sign a treaty with the British, saying, "Hey, if you'll recognize Vermont as its own colony, we'll join with you." And so that is going to prove to be a serious problem, right? We don't want states making these separate pieces with Great Britain. We have to be united in peace and war. So again, this is the Confederation Congress trying to sort of take over. Article 10 allows a committee of states to conduct business while Congress is in recess. So if Congress is not together, if a couple of states have an issue, they're welcome to get together, and then they just have to have the approval of 9 states in order to put something together. Article 11 allows for the process by which Canada can join the United States if they wish to. And then the last one, Article 13, binds each state to this document and prevents any changes without the consent of every state legislature. So this thing is going to be practically impossible to change. So we've ironed out these things. We're going to send it out. I mean, it's sent out during the Revolution, and it's still not going to be ratified until 1781. So that's how long it takes people to get on board with this thing. It's going to be very slow to change. So even through talking about the details of these articles, you can see that there are some built-in weaknesses. Principal among them, the inability to raise money, the inability to regulate currency. These are going to be probably the biggest flaws in this government, as we'll find out later on. Okay, so this is going to be the government that operates during the American Revolution. This is it. This is the United States of America during the whole span of the Revolution. So you could argue that winning the Revolution was probably one of the greatest accomplishments of this Confederation Congress. Oh, and the Vermont made a deal with the British in 1777. So I'm just trying to remember that. Anyway, so you can see that this government is going to be a loose confederation of states, right? The states retain their sovereignty and their individuality. They retain much of their powers to tax and to manage currency. The Confederation Congress is trying to take away foreign policy. You can't go off and make your own peace, but generally speaking, this will become an issue because, if we're declaring independence, where's that to stop, right? I mean, where's the idea of, well, you can't do that anymore? Where's that going to stop at? Obviously, the independent Republic of Vermont is an example of a colony or a group of people. They're not even a colony, a group of people just saying, okay, well, we declare independence from New York and New Hampshire. We're going to do our own thing. There's another state called the state of Franklin, which just pops up outside of North Carolina, on the other side of the mountains from North Carolina. And this little group of settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains, they're going to try to be a 14th state in 1784. They're just going to be like, okay, look, we're our own thing. We're across the mountains. We're far away from North Carolina. We want to be recognized. They're not going to be successful. They're going to, their state of Franklin is going to be a short-lived experiment, but still keeping these people from atomizing, from breaking off into these tiny little private little states. That's going to be an issue. So we're going to have to organize, like, how do you join the United States? How do these states, how are they formed? How are they recognized? This is going to be an issue, which the Articles do address to some degree. All right, so at this point, we've kind of talked about the writing of the Articles of Confederation. All right, so at this point, we've talked about the writing of the Articles of Confederation, and now we're going to go into how they actually operated. Now, we know that the Articles are going to be successful at winning an American Revolution, and so now we're going to look at another success that they have, and that is the success in organizing Western lands. Right, so that's our next topic. So the organization of Western lands by this Confederation Congress is going to be one of the most important things that they accomplish in the 1780s. So if we look at this map here, let me get out of the way. If we look at this map here, you'll see that we have the various states already established. And notice that this territory west of the Appalachian Mountains and in what we call the Midwest is claimed by existing states. Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, Virginia, they all claim territory in this region. And before we can even begin to organize it, we're gonna have to resolve these claims of ownership. Thomas Jefferson is going to want to organize this area into individual states and not have it belong to existing states. So that was one of Thomas Jefferson's suggestions about this. And as a result, he's going to help co-author a law, the Land Ordinance of 1784, that will exchange resolving debt with this land. All right, so basically the federal government, this Confederation Congress, will go to these various states and go, look at your debt from the war. You owe us, millions of dollars. You can either pay us the money, or you can just give us this land that we can then sell to make money. And these states will give up their claim to this land in exchange to resolve their debts. The sale of public land is going to be the most consistent way for this young government to make money. As you're going to find out, as we already found out in our previous conversation, the states are basically collecting taxes for the Confederation government, and then we'll just give them some if they want to, right? So there's no taxing power in this national government. And so the sale of land is their best way to do that. If we look at a map of the United States at this time, you will see that these are the states, the way they're laid out. And this vast unorganized territory, this is the land that we're talking about, this vast unorganized territory. It makes up the modern day states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin. So this region is what we're specifically talking about when we talk about these land ordinances and how they're going to organize them. So let's start off by talking about the Land Ordinance of 1785. This is one of the most important laws passed by the Confederation Congress. it is going to organize this vast territory into these perfectly surveyed blocks of land. Each one is exactly 1 square mile, and each little township is 6 square miles, right? So every one of these little squares represents a square mile. So we got 6 miles this way, and we've got 6 miles this way. Each square was numbered, and each one could be broken down into smaller pieces of perfectly measured land. It totaled out to about 640 acres per square mile. And you can look at this graphic here to get an idea of how they would break it up. Now, each of these squares could be bought, or you could buy any number of squares, but the Ordinance of 1785 designated certain pieces of land, certain plots of land for specific communal purposes. So, for example, plot 15, 21, 22 were reserved for a town square, for courthouses, for meeting houses and things of this nature. So that territory couldn't be used for commercial property or for private property. Number 16, plot number 16 was reserved for education purposes. So this would be schools, churches, and this would be set aside specifically to encourage education throughout the Republic. 4 blocks, 11, 8, 26, and 29, these blocks of land were withheld. So you could not buy these blocks of land. The idea was that as the town grows, these blocks of land would become more valuable because they're pretty close to the center of town. And so we'll reserve 4 square miles to sell at a later date, hopefully for higher prices, because you're trying to buy in the center of town. So this land ordinance is going to be really important in terms of organizing all this vast territory so that it can be sold and so that this government can raise a little bit of money. 2 years later, we're going to see another land ordinance. This one is monumental in terms of its precedent, and we're going to talk about it again in 1820. But the ordinance would officially establish the first territory of the United States. So we've got this vast unorganized territory. We're going to organize it into these blocks, and then now once we start to sell it, we're going to call this the Northwest Territory, right? So it's an official name of the first territory of the United States government. This is important because it establishes that the federal government, not state governments, control and regulate what happens inside these territories. Okay, this is going to be an issue when we get into the 1840s and 50s, so you're going to have to remember this. I'll remind you, but you'll have to kind of keep this in the back of your mind. Also keep in the back of your mind that in this territory, you're going to have hostile Indians, peaceful Indians. You're going to have British troops still occupying fortresses throughout the region, even though they promised to leave. They haven't, and they're going to be giving guns and ammunition and encouragement to Indian revolts. But you're also going to have settlers pouring into this region. People are going to still want land. They want land to make a living for themselves. And so all of these different groups of people are going to be flooding into this area. And the government doesn't really have control over who's there, but they are trying to, organize it. They are trying to be fair about it. One of the biggest precedents set by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is that it outlawed involuntary servitude and slavery in the territory. This is really important because it sets a precedent that the federal government, the national government, can in fact regulate slavery in these unorganized territories. That is going to be a huge issue in the 1840s and 50s. We're going to, in 1820 really. So we're going to have to keep this in mind, that the reason why there's a free North and a slave South is because of the Northwest Ordinance. Every single state in the Union in 1787 had legal slavery. Slavery is not outlawed anywhere in the United States except in these new territories. So if you're going to go into this new territory and you're going to buy this land, you're not bringing slaves with you. So it's almost like we're trying to start over fresh. We've had all these we had 100 years of British colonization. where slavery was kind of baked into the cake, and we don't want it anymore, right? We don't want slavery in our territories anymore, and so this was something that was passed, and that's an important thing to note. I did want to quote for you Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinances, because it kind of helps to give you a feeling for the attitude that our government had toward natives and toward what's going on here. So Article 3, I want to quote it. So Article 3 says, quote, "Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, and in their property, rights, and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them." So this is a transcript from the Northwest Ordinance that sort of laid out what this new government's policies are going to be toward natives, what the attitudes were toward religion and toward education and freedom, right? So the intention of the United States was to be fair with all of this stuff. But, okay, clicking your heels together like Dorothy from the Wizard of Oz and saying we're going to be fair to the Indians doesn't mean that settlers flooding into this area are going to believe that or going to go along with it. And it doesn't mean that the government's going to have the ability to enforce these laws, right? Laws are only as good as their enforcement. And so this will be a sticking point that we'll find out. The law also established the process by which territories could earn statehood. So as we're selling this land, we're telling them these are the activities you can do in these lands. This is how you're going to treat people in these lands. And as it becomes populated, as it gains more population, there's a clear process to join the United States as a 14th state, as an additional state with all of the equal rights and protections that the original 13 enjoy. So this is a very important part in U.S. history. But despite the successes of the this Articles of Confederation, this Confederation Congress, and winning the war and organizing territory, there are going to be some serious problems that have to be addressed. And the most important of those are the financial crisis, the financial woes that are going to plague this government. So we're going to start off by talking about Robert Morris. Robert Morris was called the financier of the Revolution. Okay, this was the guy who was important in terms of getting the money, raising the funds to pay for the troops and pay for the equipment that Washington and the colonial army needed to fight and be successful in this war. Morris was born in Liverpool, England in 1734, and as a teenager he migrated to the colonies and partnered with a shipping company. He later earned a seat in the Pennsylvania legislature, and he was a member of the Second Continental Congress from 1775 all the way to 1778. In 1781, the last year of the Revolution, he accepted the unenviable position as superintendent of finance. So this is a guy who's going to be shoveled into this position of, okay, take care of our budget, will you? And Morris is silly enough to try to do that. He will accept this position along with the position of agent of Marine, which is basically like Secretary of the Navy. And he's going to be vitally important, like I mentioned, to providing the supplies needed to win the war. However, states are not going to be all too excited to be giving away money to this national government. They're going to be sent bills, but they're not going to be paying them back. In November of 1781, for example, Morris wrote to Benjamin Franklin. He said something to the effect of, throughout his whole time in office, he had not received more than $100,000 from the various states. Because remember how this works. The national government says we are raising taxes. The state governments will then raise those revenues and give them to the national government. There's no enforcement. There's no way to make them do it. It's just, send them a nice letter and, ask them. So in the early years of the Confederation, Morris, after the war is over, Morris is trying to collect on this money. He's trying to pay off this debt. For example, he sent a letter to the president of Pennsylvania where he said, your state owes $1,127,794. to the federal government. And yet he had only received in payment for this barely $100,000. The situation does not get better. 2 years later, in 1783, Morris issues a letter to the various states arguing that, he's barely collected $750,000. So even in 2 years' time, plotting and going after people and sending letters and trying to get these states to pay, they're really not doing it. They're not paying at all, and this leads to some issues with finances that we need to go into more detail here. So I'm going to get out of the way so you can see it. All right. So in 1783, Morris reported the public debt as $42,375,000. The majority of this debt, like 81% of it, amounts to about $34 million, a couple of hundred, 100,000 in there, was to local creditors, right? Domestic debt was $34 million. We owed about 19%, or $7.88 million to foreigners, right? Mainly probably France. And so there's a tremendous amount of money that we owe. And you can see on this chart how successful he was at gathering money. So you can see Rhode Island and Pennsylvania had paid the most, 25% of the debt that they owe. Connecticut, New Jersey, less than 15% of what they owed. Massachusetts, 12.5%, and then in Virginia, less than 10%. Everybody there they weren't paying anything, is the point. The only state that had paid her quota was South Carolina. And of course, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, these states that we talked about, Connecticut, they were able to exchange some of this debt for land in 1785 and sort of clear the books for themselves. But that, again, that's still a problem that we're going to have here. What Morris decides is that what we need is a tariff. We need taxes, right? We're going to have taxes here. Congress is going to decide to levy duties on liquor, tea, sugar, coffee, cocoa, and molasses. Now, do I need to remind you that this whole war that we fought against the British was for duties, taxes, against, for tea and glass and all these things. And people were resisting these taxes because they didn't have representation. Well, here you go. Now you've got taxation with representation, and it's going to be pushed in that hopefully these taxes will raise about $1.5 million. That's what they're hoping this is going to raise per year to help them pay off, this $40 million debt that we have. But like I said, who collects the taxes? The individual states. Who volunteers to give up their money to the federal government? These various states, so they don't actually have to do that. Now, this isn't going to happen because any change to the Articles requires unanimous consent. Every single state has to agree. Well, let's go back and look at this chart for a moment. If we go back and look at this chart, Rhode Island has paid off a quarter of all of its debt. It's paying what it's supposed to pay. It's on a schedule. It's being responsible. So do the people of Rhode Island want to pay an additional, tax on tea and cocoa and sugar and coffee because people in New Hampshire and Delaware aren't paying and upliving to their standard, what they're supposed to do, their obligations? Of course not. So Rhode Island is going to vote no to these duty taxes in the Confederation Congress. And they're just going to send them and say, no, the people of Rhode Island are doing what they're supposed to do. Now it's time for the rest of you to step up. We're not going to pay more taxes simply because these other states are being defunct. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. So no tax is going to be approved. And that's going to be seriously frustrating for Morris. He's going to basically resign in 1784. He's like, look, I can't do anything with this. We can't raise taxes. These states aren't paying me back. I can't be responsible for this, so I'm out. So by 1784, Robert Morris resigns from his position, and we start to see the financial crisis beginning to grow, particularly because we can't pay our soldiers, and that's going to be a big problem, and that's where we're heading next. So even though we're trying to solve the problem with these duty taxes and whatnot, what we're finding is that if soldiers don't get paid what they're promised, they're going to revolt. And so we have like two major revolts to talk about. with the Army here. The first one is called the Newburgh Conspiracy. This is in March of 1783. While they're trying to get Congress to do something about this, it's going to boil over. So basically, after the American Revolution concluded at Yorktown, the Continental Army marched to Newburgh, New York, where they kind of kept a close watch on British forts and British troops in the western parts of the territory. But by December of 1782, there was a petition from the Army pleading for their back pay and their pensions, which they were promised, right? In order to volunteer, they were promised, hey, we can't pay you now, but don't worry, we're going to pay you back pay, all this money, right? And that's, of course, the $34 million that we owe, right? We owe money in part to these soldiers. These petitions are going to go unanswered. Eventually, several threatening letters will be published in newspapers, authored by men using pseudonyms like Brutus and Cato. These are, of course, famous leaders of the Roman Republic, virtuous leaders of the Roman Republic, and they're coming out saying that we should just overthrow the government, right? Just overthrow it. They're not paying our money, so let's use our arms and go after them. Frustrated with this, the officer corps of the Continental Army decided to have a meeting led by Horatio Gates, the same man who was in competition with Washington. He was jealous of Washington's success. Of course, he ruined his own reputation by running away at the Battle of Camden, but regardless, he's still involved, and he's trying to sort of create his own reaction to this situation by calling the officer corps in for a meeting. Now, Washington shows up unannounced, and this kind of takes the wind out of Horatio Gates' sails, because Washington walks into this room and he just dominates the room. He's so revered by the people. I mean, he's such a hero that he sort of personally willed the American Revolution to a successful end, right? This is a man who put his own money, his own reputation on the line in order to do this. And so he walks up to give this speech to his officer corps, and I'll quote a portion of his speech. He opened his words by saying, he pulled out his glasses, right? So he pulls out his glasses case and he's putting on his glasses, and he says, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in service of my country." And this sounds sappy and ridiculous to modern ears, but so moved and powerful was Washington's countenance and his address to these men that many of them began to weep, right? Many of these officers began to feel as though, we should be better, right? And so this Washington intervening here with his army would prevent an overall mutiny, which was on the verge of happening, and Horatio Gates would have arguably encouraged and allowed to happen. And this would sort of calm the passions, and Congress eventually would act, but obviously not until the new Constitution, right? So in 1790, under this new Constitution that we would develop, eventually the bonds would be fully paid off, and all of these men would receive their monies. But you can see that we're in sort of a desperate situation where if we can't find money to pay people, we're going to have revolts. If we can't find a way to raise taxes, we're going to have trouble. And that leads us to the next revolt we need to talk about, which was in 1786 and 1787. And this is probably the most important rebellion of the age, and that's Shays' Rebellion. So let's talk a little bit about Daniel Shays, what this rebellion was about, and how it would lead to calls for reform. Okay, so first off, Daniel Shays, he served in the American Revolution. He was born in Massachusetts of Irish stock. He was a volunteer and a Minuteman in the early months of the war. He served in Lexington. He was at Bunker Hill. He was at Saratoga. This guy worked his way up to being an officer. He was a captain in the colonial army. And after the war is over, he returns to his farm in Massachusetts, along with, thousands of other Americans who had fought in the Revolution. But what he finds out is that Massachusetts has sent him a bill. for back taxes. All of the years of the American Revolution where he hasn't been home, he hasn't been paying his taxes. He hasn't been paid at all because none of the soldiers have been paid, right? We just explained they won't be paid fully for a couple of years in the future. So he doesn't have the money. And so here comes the Massachusetts government saying, no, you owe these back taxes. And if you don't pay them, we're gonna take your land from you and we're gonna sell it. This is serious, right? So here I am fighting for the freedom, fighting for my land, and then after the war's over and I've won, I come back to my land and the Massachusetts government is going to be a tyrannical taxing entity stealing my land from me? I don't think so. We just got through fighting Britain. I'm pretty sure we can fight Massachusetts. So Daniel Shays is going to, bring like 300 men together. These former colonial soldiers, they're going to form a group of like 300 men, and they're going to protest. They're going to march on Springfield, Massachusetts, delaying courts and preventing the eviction notices and things like from happening. And so the government calls in the militia, like, hey, put down this revolt. And the militia looks around and goes, yeah, but we agree with them. We haven't been paid either. So the militia is on the side of Daniel Shays, and all these volunteers are coming out of the woodworks, and the government of Massachusetts is in a little bit of pain here. And keep in mind that the people who are in the government, they're the people that loaned money, right? They're the people who gave money to the government so that we could win the war. They expect their money to be paid back. So there's both sides of this thing are being problematic. The Confederation Congress is powerless to do anything to put down this pretty violent revolt. I mean, in February of 1787, Daniel Shays and his little group of men are going to try to attack an armory and steal weapons, shot and powder, so that they can exacerbate their attempt to take over Massachusetts. It is put down, but only because these members of Congress and these courts, these wealthy people, hired their own militia, right? They had to go and hire their own militia to put this down. So the Confederation Congress is going to be incapable of defending itself against internal revolt. It's not able to put down problems with its own soldiers. The inability to tax, the inability to raise funds and pay these soldiers is creating just a domino effect of debt and inability of people to solve their problems. Now keep in mind, it's in this environment that this call for a new constitutional convention is being laid out. This constitutional convention will meet in May of 1787, the same year that Shay's rebellion is dangerously getting close to open revolt. So our next issue is going to be, okay, what's the history of reform, right? So what were people trying to do to fix the Articles of Confederation before it got to this point? And that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, so as we've mentioned here, there are some difficulties that the Articles of Confederation are having. This Confederation Congress is not able to put down revolts. It's not able to raise money, pay off its soldiers. So there are some issues here that are causing complications. And these issues go all the way back to, 1783. Hell, they go all the way back to the 1777. So these are not new issues. But starting in about March of 1785 is when some states and some people are going to start to make some requests to reform and change these articles. They're not going to get a lot of attention. They're not going to make a lot of traction or get a lot of popularity behind their movement to reform the articles, because most people are happy with the articles. Most people don't care. That's why they're not making an issue. It won't be until Shay's rebellion that you get enough people worried about the stability of the government that you're going to see a movement to reform the government in a major way, which will lead us to our next conversation about the Constitutional Convention. So let's start off by talking about some of the early attempts to reform the Articles of Confederation. First, we have the Mount Vernon Convention. This was in March of 1785. This results in an argument between Virginia and Maryland. Maryland had controlled the Potomac River traditionally while they were colonies, and they wanted to get together. These two colonies wanted to meet and hammer out an agreement on how to share responsibility for this waterway. They had planned to meet in Alexandria, Virginia in March of 1785 to hammer out the details. Unfortunately, the Virginia governor, Patrick Henry, failed to mention this problem. He failed to mention it altogether, and the Virginia delegates never showed up. So these people from Maryland came in, and no one was there to meet them. And just so happened that George Washington was in the area, and he was meeting with these gentlemen who were supposed to reform and talk about some improvements here. And Washington said, well, come on to my house. Come on to my house, and we can have your conference there, and I'll put you up, and we can do it. And so they decided to go and meet in Mount Vernon. They did several days of negotiation. The delegates offered their respective legislatures a resolution. However, the committee did recommend that the Potomac become a shared waterway, that Virginia and Maryland share the costs of construction and improvements, and that they share fishing rights. So this was a pretty successful convention between these two states, and this was approved by the Articles, right? The Articles said that when Congress is not in session, states can get together and make these kinds of agreements. And this would encourage Virginians to propose that each state consider commerce issues and meet for the purposes of creating legislation to offer to the Confederation Congress, right? So we had some success at Mount Vernon. Okay, well, that was only 2 states. Let's get all the states together. Let's have a general convention of all the states so that we can, improve our commerce relations. This was supported by James Madison, a young Virginia politician. He was a known opponent to the current Constitution. He was someone who definitely wanted to strengthen this national government so that it could handle taxation issues and revolts like the Newburgh Conspiracy and things like this. This new group of people would agree to meet in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786, the next year. Several northern states suffered from British trade restrictions. They feared the inability of Congress to act, and the Massachusetts government requested that their delegates propose sweeping changes and reforms to the Confederation. But most of the delegates aren't going to be free to just talk about whatever they want to talk about. This meeting is going to include delegates from 5 states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia. And interestingly, Maryland, the host state, failed to send delegates altogether. In attendance, you would see some very experienced men like John Dickinson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. These are going to be some movers and shakers in terms of pushing for reform and writing a new constitution. In order to prepare himself for this meeting in Annapolis, James Madison studied constitutions in a very big way. He's going to be moving to study these constitutions in order to be able to figure out how to best write and reform the existing Constitution. Now, 4 of these 5 states directed their delegates to discuss only commerce and trade. They couldn't discuss anything else. New Jersey was an exception to this. They were allowed to discuss, quote, other important matters. So the commissioners feared that they would overstep their mandate if they started discussing, taxation, if they started discussing, more detailed attempts to reform the Articles of Confederation. And so they wrote a report, and in this report they basically said, we want to meet again. We want to meet again, but we want all of the delegates to allow us to discuss whatever we need to discuss, right? So they didn't want to overstep themselves. They wanted to be able to meet again, this time the very next year in 1787 in Philadelphia for the purposes of discussing more systemic changes to the Articles of Confederation. Up until this time, as I've already mentioned, there hasn't been that much success in getting people to get involved in these reform efforts. But Shay's Rebellion is in 1887, 1886, 87, and that is going to spur a lot of people. So a lot of colonies are going to show, a lot of these states are going to send delegates to Philadelphia in May of 1787 in order to discuss and write a new constitution. And that's what we're going to discuss next time, is the Constitutional Convention and its ratification between 1787 and 1789. See you there.